In the autumn of 2023, in Salem, a miracle of the Virgin Mary began to manifest in a way no one could have imagined. A story that would involve a little girl, only 3 years and 5 months old, a century-old mirror, and supernatural events that would divide an entire community between faith and reason. But before we begin, I need to ask you a sincere question. Do you believe that the Virgin Mary still performs miracles today? If your answer is yes, leave a comment saying, "I believe in the miracles of the Virgin Mary," and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because here, miracles happen every day. Margaret Murphy, 68 years old, had always been a woman of unshakable faith. Born and raised in the Irish Catholic tradition, Margaret lives in an 1892 Victorian house where a century-old mirror, an heirloom from her great-grandmother, dominates the living room. On weekends, her son Thomas, his wife Sarah, and little Elizabeth, a 3-year-old girl with curly hair and bright green eyes who was the joy of the family, always visited Margaret, and Elizabeth loved exploring her grandmother's old house, especially fascinated by the large mirror in the living room. On May 15, 2023, a storm capsized Thomas and Sarah's boat. They did not survive, and Elizabeth was left in her grandmother's care. In the days that followed came the paperwork, the adjustments, and the sleepless nights. Elizabeth had stopped talking as much as before, spending long periods staring out the window as if waiting for her parents to arrive. She had crying fits, refused to eat, and woke up several times at night calling for her parents. Margaret, despite her age and her own grief, showed a strength and dedication that impressed everyone around her. The local Catholic community, led by Father Michael O'Brien, offered all the support they could. Neighbors brought food, offered help with Elizabeth, and constantly included the two of them in their prayers. It was during this difficult period that Margaret began to notice something different in Elizabeth's behavior toward the old mirror in the living room. The little girl, who used to simply glance at the mirror with curiosity during visits, now seemed fascinated by it. Margaret often found her standing still in front of the mirror, sometimes whispering softly, other times just watching in silence. When asked what she was doing, Elizabeth would always answer vaguely, "Just looking, Grandma Maggie," or "The mirror is pretty." It was understandable, Margaret thought. The child was dealing with trauma in a way that made sense to her. Perhaps the mirror offered some kind of comfort or distraction from the painful reality she was living. But everything changed on the morning of May 28, 2023, exactly 13 days after the accident. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard Elizabeth talking in the living room. At first, she thought the girl was playing with her dolls or talking to herself, something common for children her age. But when she paid closer attention, she realized Elizabeth was having a clear, coherent conversation with someone. "Hello, pretty lady," Elizabeth said in a cheerful voice Margaret hadn't heard in weeks. "Do you live in the mirror?" Margaret dropped the toast she was preparing and quietly walked to the living room doorway. What she saw made her heart stop for a moment. Elizabeth was sitting on the floor, cross-legged in front of the old mirror, speaking as if she were talking to a real person. "Elizabeth, dear," Margaret said softly, "who are you talking to?" Elizabeth turned with a radiant smile on her face, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen since the accident. "With the pretty lady in the mirror, Grandma Maggie. She's wearing a very beautiful blue dress." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She looked at the mirror, but all she saw was the normal reflection of the room. "Elizabeth, what else is this lady saying to you?" Elizabeth turned back to the mirror and stayed silent for a few seconds, as if she were listening to something. Then she said, "She said Mr. Patterson next door lost his cat last night, but he's okay. He's sleeping under the blue house at the end of the street." Margaret knew James Patterson well, her 72-year-old neighbor who had lived alone for 5 years since losing his wife. He really did have an orange cat named Rusty, but Margaret had no idea whether the animal was missing. "How do you know about Mr. Patterson's cat, Elizabeth?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "The pretty lady told me. She said she takes care of everyone on our street, and that we don't have to worry," Elizabeth replied with the natural ease of a child recounting a normal conversation. Margaret decided to investigate. Around 10 in the morning, she walked over to Mr. Patterson's house and knocked on the door. James opened it, his eyes red from crying. "Margaret, it's good to see you. How is little Elizabeth?" he asked, trying to hide the sadness in his voice. "She's adjusting, James, but tell me, is everything all right? You look worried." James let out a deep sigh. "It's Rusty, Margaret. He disappeared last night. He went out after dinner as he always does, but he never came back. I spent the whole night looking for him. I'm desperate. He's all I have." Margaret felt her heart race. "James, this might sound strange, but Elizabeth mentioned something about Rusty being under a blue house at the end of the street. Have you looked there?" James furrowed his brows. "Blue house at the end of the street. You mean the Johnsons' place?" "No, I haven't looked there yet. But how would Elizabeth know anything about Rusty?" "I'm not sure," Margaret answered honestly. "But how about we go take a look?" The two of them walked together to the Johnsons' house, a light blue Victorian home. James crouched down and looked under the raised porch. Within seconds he exclaimed, "Rusty! My God, he's here!" The orange cat was curled up under the house, apparently fast asleep. James called to him softly, and Rusty ran toward his owner, meowing happily. "Margaret," James said with tears in his eyes, "how did Elizabeth know he was here?" Margaret had no answer. She just shook her head and said, "Sometimes children notice things that we don't." Margaret spent the rest of the day thinking about the incident. Was there a logical explanation? Maybe Elizabeth had seen the cat by chance at some point, or maybe it was just a lucky coincidence. But something about the girl's certainty, the specificity of her details, made Margaret wonder if there was something more going on. Margaret didn't know, but this would be only the first of many unexplainable signs yet to come. That night, Margaret decided to talk more seriously with Elizabeth about her conversations with the mirror. "Elizabeth, sweetheart, can you tell me more about the pretty lady you see in the mirror?" Elizabeth was playing with her dolls in the living room, but immediately lit up at the question. "She's very kind, Grandma Maggie. She has long dark hair and always wears the same blue dress. And she's always smiling." "And what else does she say to you?" "She said, Mommy and Daddy are fine, that they're in a beautiful place full of flowers and that they're not sad. And she said that you're very tired from taking care of me, but that you're very brave." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. She really was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but had never shown it in front of Elizabeth. "Elizabeth, did you tell the pretty lady that I'm tired?" "No, Grandma Maggie. She told me." "She knows everything. And she said something very important, that she's taking care of us." That night, Margaret had trouble sleeping. As a practicing Catholic, she had read about Marian apparitions throughout history, Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe. But she had always imagined these experiences were reserved for saints or specially chosen people, not for her 3-year-old granddaughter in their living room. Still, she couldn't deny what had happened with Mr. Patterson's cat. And there was something about the peace Elizabeth showed when talking about her conversations with the mirror that Margaret hadn't seen since before the tragedy. She was beginning to wonder if it could be a sign from the Virgin Mary. She decided to watch more closely, but without interfering. In the following days, Elizabeth continued her routine of talking with the mirror. It usually happened in the morning after breakfast, and again in the late afternoon before dinner. Margaret began discreetly writing down everything Elizabeth said after these conversations. On May 30th, Elizabeth came out of the living room with a worried expression. "Grandma Maggie, the pretty lady said that Mrs. Williams from up the street is very sick, but she doesn't know it yet. She said Mrs. Williams needs to go to the doctor before Friday." Margaret knew Helen Williams, a 55-year-old woman who worked as a librarian at the municipal library. She had always been a cheerful and seemingly healthy person. How could Margaret approach someone she barely knew with such information? But the certainty in Elizabeth's voice, combined with her accuracy about James Patterson's cat, made Margaret decide to take the risk. On Thursday, Margaret walked to the public library during opening hours. Helen was at the main counter, cataloging new books. "Helen, how have you been feeling lately?" Margaret asked casually. Helen stopped what she was doing and looked at Margaret with surprise. "That's funny you ask, Margaret. I've been feeling a bit strange these past few days. A little more tired than usual, some headaches. But nothing serious, I suppose?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Helen, I know this might sound presumptuous, but have you considered getting a medical checkup? Sometimes these small symptoms can be signs of something worth checking out." Helen thought about Margaret's words. "You know what? You're right. It's been over a year since my last routine exams. I'll call Dr. Martinez today to book an appointment." On Friday morning, Helen Williams called Margaret, clearly shaken. "Margaret, I needed to thank you. I went to Dr. Martinez yesterday afternoon, and he found something in my blood tests. My glucose levels are dangerously high. He said that if I had waited a few more weeks, I could have had serious problems." "How did you know I needed to see a doctor?" Margaret didn't know what to say. "Sometimes we just have an intuition about these things, Helen. The important thing is that you're okay now." When Margaret hung up the phone, she found Elizabeth in the living room, sitting in front of the mirror. "The pretty lady said Mrs. Williams is going to be fine now," Elizabeth said, without even turning around. Margaret sat down next to Elizabeth on the living room floor. "Elizabeth, can you ask the pretty lady how she knows all these things?" Elizabeth stayed silent for a few moments, staring intently into the mirror. Then she said she takes care of everyone who needs it, especially children and older people." Elizabeth's words deeply moved Margaret. There was a wisdom in the girl's answer that seemed far beyond her 3 years and 5 months. Margaret began to cry. Elizabeth stood up and hugged her grandmother with a surprising strength for such a small child. "Don't cry, Grandma Maggie. The pretty lady said everything is going to be okay." The news about Elizabeth's predictions began to quietly spread around the neighborhood. James Patterson mentioned the cat story to some friends at the local chess club. Helen Williams told a few colleagues at the library about Margaret's medical advice. In a small town like Salem, where everyone knows each other, it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Margaret Murphy's granddaughter, the poor, orphaned little girl, seemed to have a special ability to know things she shouldn't know. In early June, Margaret began receiving visits from curious neighbors, people she only knew by sight, with whom she had never had deep conversations, started showing up at her door with casual excuses to visit. "I came to see how you're settling in," said one. "I brought some homemade cookies," said another. But Margaret could tell they were all genuinely curious about Elizabeth and her conversations with the mirror. Margaret tried to keep the situation discreet. She neither confirmed nor denied the stories going around, and always steered conversations back to more mundane topics. But Elizabeth, being a child, didn't have the same filter. When Mrs. Anderson, a neighbor from the next street, came for a social visit, Elizabeth immediately walked up to her. "You're worried about your son, aren't you?" Elizabeth said naturally. Mrs. Anderson nearly dropped her teacup. What did you say, dear?" "The pretty lady told me your son is fine, that he's just having a hard time at his new job. She said he'll call you on Sunday." Margaret saw Mrs. Anderson's face go pale. The woman had indeed been worried about her 28-year-old son, Kevin, who had moved to Boston 2 months earlier for a new job and rarely called. "Elizabeth," Margaret said quickly, "how about we go to the garden and see how the flowers are doing?" But the damage was done. Mrs. Anderson left the house completely shaken, and Margaret knew the story would spread even further. On Sunday, just as Elizabeth had predicted, Kevin Anderson called his mother to talk about the challenges at his new job and to reassure her that he was doing fine. From that moment on, Margaret realized it would be impossible to keep the situation secret for much longer. During the first week of June, the visits became more frequent and more direct. People began showing up specifically to meet Elizabeth or to see the famous mirror. Margaret felt uncomfortable with the attention, but didn't want to be rude to the neighbors who had always been kind to her. Even more concerning, Elizabeth seemed to be enjoying the attention. She lit up when visitors arrived and often offered unsolicited information about their lives. To Mrs. Kelly, an elderly lady who lived alone, the pretty lady said, "Your sister from California will call tomorrow with good news from the doctor." To the Thompson family, the pretty lady said, "You'll find Grandma's lost wedding ring inside the cookie tin in the kitchen." And surprisingly, all these predictions came true in the following days. Margaret began to feel overwhelmed. She had devoted her life to education and had always valued logic and rational thinking. How could she explain events that seemed to defy any logical explanation? She decided to seek spiritual guidance from Father Michael O'Brien. Father Michael was a 58-year-old man, Irish by birth, who had served the Catholic community of Salem for more than 20 years. He was known for his wisdom, compassion, and his balanced approach between faith and reason. Margaret scheduled a conversation with Father Michael for a Thursday afternoon when Elizabeth would be at daycare. "Father Michael," Margaret began, "I need to talk to you about something very delicate." Margaret told the entire story from the beginning, the tragedy with Thomas and Sarah, Elizabeth's trauma, the start of her conversations with the mirror, and the predictions that were becoming increasingly accurate and known in the neighborhood. Father Michael listened to everything in silence, asking only a few clarifying questions. When Margaret finished, he remained thoughtful for several minutes. "Margaret," he finally said, "in more than 20 years of priesthood, I have heard many stories. Some were clearly the product of imagination or psychological trauma. Others were harder to explain." "Do you believe this is real?" Margaret asked. "The Church recognizes that God can manifest himself in many ways, and that the Virgin Mary has appeared to the faithful throughout history. Many cases recognized as miracles of the Virgin Mary began with simple signs like this. But we also know that great care and discernment are needed in situations like this." Father Michael explained that there were specific criteria the Church used to evaluate possible Marian apparitions: the spiritual fruits in the person's life, the consistency of the message with Church teachings, and the absence of any search for attention or material gain. "In Elizabeth's case," he continued, "I see a child who has been through deep trauma and who has found a source of comfort. The messages she reports are all positive and focused on helping other people. That is consistent with the maternal character of Mary. So you think we should allow this to continue? Margaret, my recommendation is this: carefully observe the fruits of this experience in Elizabeth's life and in the lives of those around her. If she becomes more loving, more compassionate, and closer to God, then there are reasons to consider that something positive is happening." Father Michael also suggested that Margaret establish some rules. Elizabeth's conversations with the mirror should be private and not a spectacle for visitors, and if the situation began to negatively affect Elizabeth or the family, they should reconsider the whole matter. Margaret left the conversation with Father Michael feeling calmer and with a clear plan of action. That night, she spoke with Elizabeth about the importance of keeping her special conversations as something private, just between her, Grandma, and the pretty lady. "Special things are more beautiful when they aren't for everyone to see," Margaret explained. "It's like a good secret that only very special people share." Elizabeth, with the natural wisdom of children, seemed to understand perfectly. "Like when you and Grandpa had special conversations that were just between you two." Margaret was surprised. Elizabeth had never met Harold Murphy, the grandfather who had died 5 years before she was born. "How do you know about Grandpa Harold, dear?" The pretty lady told me. She said he's taking care of Mommy and Daddy now, and that he sends you a special hug. Margaret felt a wave of emotion. Harold really used to talk with her about things they kept just between themselves, plans for retirement, worries about Thomas, dreams for the future. From that conversation with Father Michael, Margaret established new rules for the house. Elizabeth's conversations with the mirror would continue, but they would be private. Margaret would no longer allow visitors who came specifically to meet Elizabeth or to hear about her experiences. To the neighbors who insisted, Margaret would diplomatically explain that Elizabeth was still a very young child who was processing the loss of her parents, and that the family needed privacy during this difficult time. The strategy worked for a few weeks. June passed relatively calmly with only occasional predictions from Elizabeth during her morning and afternoon conversations with the mirror. She continued to display knowledge about situations she should not have known about. One morning she said that the mailman was sad because his mother was sick. When Margaret discreetly spoke with Joe Peterson, the mailman, he confirmed that his 84-year-old mother had been hospitalized 3 days earlier. Another day, Elizabeth mentioned that the preschool teacher was worried about the results of a medical exam, but that everything would be all right. When Margaret went to pick up Elizabeth from preschool, the teacher, Miss Rodriguez, spontaneously shared that she had undergone a biopsy the previous week and was nervously waiting for the results. The next day, Miss Rodriguez called Margaret, overjoyed. The result had come back benign. Margaret continued discreetly documenting these occurrences, following Father Michael's guidance to observe the patterns and the fruits of Elizabeth's experiences. What she observed was consistent. Elizabeth was becoming a more empathetic, more loving child and surprisingly mature for her age. The initial trauma of losing her parents seemed to be gradually healing through these conversations with the mirror. Elizabeth was also developing spiritually. She had begun asking to go to Mass with Margaret, something she had never shown interest in before. During prayers, she appeared exceptionally focused and reverent. "Grandma Maggie," she said one night, "the pretty lady taught me a new prayer. Do you want to hear it?" Elizabeth then recited a prayer Margaret had never heard before, but which was completely appropriate and beautiful. "Mary, Mother of Jesus, thank you for taking care of all families. Help sad people become happy and sick people get well. And thank you for taking care of my mommy and daddy in heaven." But at the end of June, something happened that would completely change the dynamics of the situation. Elizabeth was having her morning conversation with the mirror when she suddenly became very serious. She stayed silent for much longer than usual, almost 10 minutes, just staring intently at the mirror. When she finally got up, she ran to the kitchen where Margaret was preparing lunch. Grandma Maggie, she shouted urgently. "The pretty lady said I need to talk to you about something very important that's going to happen." Margaret turned off the stove and knelt down to Elizabeth's level to hear what she had to say. "What is it, my dear?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, with a seriousness that didn't match her 3 years of age. "The pretty lady said something very special is going to happen on Sunday after Mass. She said many people will come here, but that we shouldn't be afraid." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. "What kind of special thing, Elizabeth?" "She didn't tell me everything, but she said it's to help many people, and Grandma Maggie—" Elizabeth hesitated, as if trying to remember the exact words. "She said you're going to need to be very brave, like when you took care of me after Mommy and Daddy went to heaven." Margaret hugged Elizabeth, but her mind was racing. What kind of event could be approaching? And why was the pretty lady preparing Elizabeth and her for something special? Sunday, July the 2nd, 2023, began like any other. Margaret and Elizabeth went to the 9 a.m. Mass at the church as they did every week. Elizabeth behaved normally, praying with focus and singing with her sweet voice. After Mass, Margaret stopped briefly to talk with Father Michael about the preparations for the parish festival. Elizabeth waited patiently beside them, drawing on the ground with a stick. "Father Michael," said a voice behind them. It was Helen Williams, the librarian whom Elizabeth had helped discover her diabetes. "I need to tell you something extraordinary that happened last night." Margaret and Father Michael turned to listen. "My sister Nancy came to visit me from Boston. She's going through a very difficult divorce and has been struggling for months. Last night she was sleeping on my couch when she woke up around 3 in the morning. She swears she saw a woman dressed in blue sitting in the armchair next to the couch." Father Michael furrowed his brows. "What else did your sister say?" "The woman didn't say anything. She just smiled and made a gesture of blessing over Nancy. My sister said she felt a peace she hadn't felt in months. When she woke up this morning, she was completely different, determined. She decided to go back to Boston today to start a new life." Margaret looked at Elizabeth, who had stopped drawing and was listening closely to the conversation. "And there's more," Helen continued. "Nancy has never heard about Elizabeth or the things that have been happening here. But when I described the woman Elizabeth sees in the mirror, blue dress, dark hair, Nancy went pale. It was exactly the same woman she saw last night." Father Michael looked thoughtful. "Helen, would your sister be willing to talk to me about this experience?" "She's already left for Boston, Father, but she left me this." Helen pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket. She said she woke up with these words in her head and wrote them down so she wouldn't forget. The paper contained a message written in hurried handwriting. "Today, something important will begin." Margaret felt her legs go weak. Elizabeth had predicted exactly this on Thursday. "Father Michael," Margaret said with a trembling voice, "I need to tell you what Elizabeth told me on Thursday." When Margaret finished recounting Elizabeth's prediction, Father Michael was silent for several minutes. When Margaret and Elizabeth arrived home after the parish lunch, there were already 3 cars parked in front of the house. Margaret recognized Mrs. Anderson, James Patterson, and the Thompson family. They were waiting patiently in the front yard. Mrs. Murphy, Mrs. Anderson approached. "We hope you don't mind our visit. It's just that, well, strange things have been happening since last night, and they all seem connected to Elizabeth." James Patterson stepped closer as well. "Margaret, my brother Paul called from Chicago this morning. He said he had a dream about a woman in a blue dress who gave him a specific message for Elizabeth. He had never even heard of Elizabeth before." Margaret felt like she was losing control of the situation. "What message, James?" She said, "Tell the girl in the mirror that it is time to share the gift she received. Many people need healing for their hearts." Elizabeth tugged on Margaret's hand. "Grandma Maggie, the pretty lady told me this was going to happen," she said. "I can't keep the conversations just between us anymore." Throughout the afternoon, more people arrived, not only from Salem, but from nearby towns as well. The news about a possible miracle of the Virgin Mary involving Elizabeth had spread through social media, among relatives, and through the kind of word of mouth that travels quickly in small communities. By around 4 in the afternoon, there were about 30 people in Margaret's front yard. They had all heard different versions of Elizabeth's story, and many recounted dreams or experiences similar to those of Nancy Williams. Margaret felt overwhelmed. She called Father Michael, who arrived within 20 minutes. "Father," Margaret said privately, "I don't know how to handle this. Elizabeth is just a child." Father Michael watched Elizabeth, who seemed oblivious to the crowd outside the house. "Margaret, let me speak with Elizabeth alone for a few minutes." Father Michael found Elizabeth sitting in front of the mirror in the living room, but she wasn't talking. She was simply watching her own reflection. "Elizabeth, are you okay?" "Yes, Father Michael. The pretty lady told me you were going to come talk to me." "And what else did she say?" Elizabeth turned to face him. "She said today is special because many people who have broken hearts, like I did, will be able to feel they are not alone. But she also said that after today, I will go back to being a normal little girl." Father Michael was surprised. "What do you mean, Elizabeth?" The pretty lady explained that she helped me when I needed it most, and that through me, she can help other people today. But she said, I need to grow and learn other things, and that it's not good for a child to carry adults' worries for too long. The wisdom in Elizabeth's answer deeply impressed Father Michael. Elizabeth, would you feel comfortable talking to the people who came here today? Not to make predictions or give messages, just to tell them about your conversations with the pretty lady. Elizabeth thought for a moment. I can do that, but the pretty lady said it has to be the last time. Father Michael arranged a gathering in the backyard garden of Margaret's house. 30 people sat in a circle on the grass, with Elizabeth in the center, sitting on Margaret's lap. This little girl went through a terrible time just a few months ago, Father Michael began. Losing one's parents is one of the hardest experiences anyone can face, especially a child. But through her innocent faith and openness to the divine, Elizabeth received a gift of consolation, a miracle from the Virgin Mary, which she wishes to share with you today. Elizabeth spoke with the simplicity and honesty of a 3-year-old. She told them how sad she had been when she first came to Grandma Maggie's house, how she had begun to see the pretty lady in the mirror, and how those conversations helped her understand that her parents were okay and that she would be cared for. The pretty lady told me that all of you have hearts that are hurt like mine was, Elizabeth said, looking around the circle. She wants you to know that she takes care of everyone, especially when they are very sad. A woman in the circle began to cry. Elizabeth, could you ask the pretty lady about my son? He passed away 6 months ago. Elizabeth was silent for a moment, as if listening to something. Then she said, The pretty lady said your son is fine and that he wants you to stop blaming yourself for the accident. She said it wasn't your fault. The woman broke down in tears. Later, she would explain to Margaret that she had blamed herself for the accident because she had asked her son to go to the supermarket that night. An older man asked about his wife, who suffered from Alzheimer's. Elizabeth said that the pretty lady explained that some illnesses are part of life, but that love never disappears, even when memories become confused. For 2 hours, Elizabeth answered questions and shared messages of hope. They weren't specific predictions like the ones she had made before, but words of comfort and encouragement. When the gathering ended, many people reported a sense of peace they hadn't felt in months or even years. That night, after everyone had gone, Elizabeth sat once again in front of the mirror. Margaret watched her from the living room doorway. Grandma Maggie, Elizabeth said without turning around. The pretty lady said that was the last conversation. She said thank you for letting me help sad people. Elizabeth stood up and walked over to Margaret. She also said that now I can play and learn kid things. Margaret hugged Elizabeth. And how do you feel about that, dear? Happy, Elizabeth replied simply. I liked helping people, but I also want to play with other kids and learn how to ride a bike. In the days that followed, Margaret received dozens of calls and visits from people who had attended the Sunday gathering. Many reported positive changes in their lives, not dramatic miracles, but a renewal of hope and the ability to move forward after losses and tragedies. Mrs. Davidson, who had lost her husband the previous year, said she had finally managed to sleep through an entire night without nightmares. Mr. Rodriguez, who had been unemployed for 8 months, felt the courage to start a small business of his own. The Chen family, who had lost their teenage daughter in an accident, decided to establish a scholarship in her memory. Elizabeth, for her part, never again showed any special interest in the old mirror. She began attending a local daycare full-time, made friends, learned to ride a bicycle, and developed like any normal and healthy child. Occasionally, Margaret would find her gazing thoughtfully at the mirror. 3 months after the events of July, Father Michael visited Margaret for a follow-up conversation. How do you assess everything that happened, Margaret? He asked. Margaret served tea and homemade cookies, thinking carefully about her answer. Father Michael, I can't explain scientifically what happened, but I can tell you about the fruits. Elizabeth has completely recovered from the trauma of losing her parents. She is happy, healthy, and developing normally. And many people in our community found peace and hope when they needed it most. Father Michael nodded. That's a wise assessment. The Church has always taught that we must know the tree by its fruits. And there's one more thing, Margaret added. Since July, our community has become more united. People care more about each other, visit elderly neighbors, help families going through hardships. It's as if everyone has remembered the importance of taking care of one another. Elizabeth ran into the room, her hands covered in garden soil and a radiant smile on her face. "Grandma Maggie, I planted all the sunflower seeds. Will you come see?" Margaret smiled, remembering the silent and traumatized little girl who had arrived at her house only 7 months earlier. "Of course, dear." "Father Michael, would you like to see Elizabeth's garden?" As they walked through the backyard garden where Elizabeth had planted neat rows of sunflowers, Father Michael reflected on the nature of miracles. "You know, Margaret, sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the spectacular events that defy the laws of nature. Sometimes they're the small transformations of the human heart, the healing of trauma, the rebirth of hope, the rediscovery of the ability to love and care for one another." Height. Elizabeth was kneeling beside a small sunflower sprout, carefully watering it with a toy watering can. "Elizabeth," Father Michael said, "do you think your sunflowers will grow well here?" Elizabeth looked up with her eyes shining. "I'm sure they will, Father Michael. Grandma Maggie said that when we plant something with love, it always grows strong and beautiful." An entire year had passed since the events of July 2023. Elizabeth was thriving in kindergarten, had made many friends, and showed natural talents for art and music. She rarely mentioned her former conversations with the mirror, except occasionally when she saw someone who looked very sad. "That lady looks like she needs a hug," she said one day when a neighbor walked by, visibly worried. "Shall we go say hello to her, Grandma Maggie?" And they did, not with supernatural messages, but simply with the basic human kindness of asking how someone was and offering help if needed. Margaret often reflected on those extraordinary months. There were moments when she herself doubted whether everything had really happened the way she remembered. But then she would look at Elizabeth, joyful, loving, completely healed from the trauma, and at the community around them, which seemed permanently changed for the better, and she knew that something real and meaningful had occurred. The mirror was still in the same place in the living room. Occasionally, visitors asked about it, especially those who knew the story. Margaret always gave a simple answer. "It's a mirror that has been in our family for generations." Sometimes the most ordinary things can become special when we need them. In the autumn of 2024, more than a year after the events, Margaret decided to write a detailed account of everything that had happened. She wanted to preserve the story for Elizabeth when she was older. As she wrote, Elizabeth played on the living room floor, assembling a puzzle. Every now and then, she glanced at the mirror, but without any particular interest. "Elizabeth," Margaret asked one day, "do you remember your conversations with the pretty lady?" Elizabeth stopped putting the puzzle together and thought for a moment. "I remember a little bit, Grandma Maggie. I remember she was very kind and that she helped me when I was really sad. And I remember she said that many people needed to know they weren't alone." "Do you miss those conversations?" Elizabeth shook her head. "No, Grandma Maggie. Now I know she's still taking care of everyone, even without needing to talk in the mirror. And I have you and my friends from school and the church and all the neighbors who like us." Margaret smiled, realizing the deep wisdom in the child's simple answer. "And you know what else, Grandma Maggie?" Elizabeth continued, returning to her puzzle. "I think when people are kind to each other, it's like the pretty lady is there too." The story of the miracle of the Virgin Mary in Salem reminds us that the most enduring miracles are not always the most spectacular. Sometimes they are simply the return of joy to the face of a traumatized child, and the transformation of a community into a place where people genuinely care for one another. And perhaps, in the end, that is miracle enough for any of us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. And if you have your own experience of faith to share, tell us in the comments. Because sometimes all we need is a reminder that hope is possible, even when it seems most distant. And if you believe that miracles of Mary still happen today, leave a comment saying, "I believe," because shared faith is always stronger than isolated faith. Subscribe to the channel for more stories where faith, mystery, and the human heart come together in unforgettable moments. Because in a world that sometimes feels cold and fragmented, we need to be reminded that love, hope, and compassion are still the most powerful forces in the universe.